turn tonight to Luke chapter 2. We're having a little bit of a break from Hosea. I want to talk about the incident described in Luke 2 from 39 through to verse 52. This is one of the final messages that I want to bring while I'm away. The theme of the camp that I'll be going to is it's called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. It was a title of a book written by Eugene Peterson, who became famous by giving the world the message, the not translation, it was something or other. Paraphrase, that's right, of the scriptures, but he was certainly a prolific writer, and that was a bestseller, this Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And the funny thing is that it wasn't his quote, didn't come from him. He quoted, I think, Philip Nitschke, of all people, who coined the phrase. I mean, it sounds good, and even he, this humanist philosopher, knew there was something to be said of a long, consistent obedience in the same direction. And so most of the messages are going to be around the Old Testament prophets, looking at their long ministries. But I wanted to finish the weekend by coming back to Jesus Christ. He's the ultimate prophet, the New Testament says. Hebrews 1 says that in time past God has spoken unto us by the prophets, but has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. And so I wanted to try and see, does Jesus fit in to this thinking as well? Does he fit under the theme, a long obedience in the same direction? And here's why I asked the question. He didn't live very long. He didn't live all that long. He died at the age of about 33, ascends after his resurrection 40 days later. So he lived for 33 years, but some of the Old Testament prophets ministered longer than 33 years. I mean, longer than he was alive. So can we look at Jesus' life and say there was a long obedience in the same direction? Well, he certainly had a unique life, and it was comparatively brief, certainly. But I think we will see tonight that though relatively brief, as we like to say, it's not quantity, it is quality. And so we are going to look at a passage that deals with the upbringing of Jesus and his growth into adulthood. And you know the passage, you know where I'm coming towards. It's at the end of Luke 2, where Jesus is there in the temple. But that incident is sandwiched between verse 40 and verse 52. And both verses are very similar. They're very similar. In verse 40, the child grew, became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Down in verse 52, Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and man. Remember, at the end of John's Gospel, John says that if we tried to write more about Jesus' life, he said there are many other things that Jesus did, and if they were written, each one, he said that not even the world could contain the books that would be written. And I suppose that the thought here is that if we had all of these other writings about Jesus' life, as much as they would interest us, they would probably endlessly distract us. They would endlessly distract us. I mean, you could at least have a 33-volume account of the life of Jesus, at least. And then, of course, the Gospels themselves are mainly devoted to that 1 week of his life. 1 week, not, there's no even spread. So God wants us to focus on not even the birth of Jesus, not even this account for that matter, not even this account, But our main focus is to be on what Jesus did on the cross. Oh, that's deliberate. He lived a perfect life that he might die a unique death. And so in verse 39 of Luke 2, so when they'd performed all these things, this is Christ there in the temple, okay, as an infant. When they'd performed all these things according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee and to their own city, Nazareth. And between verse 39 and 40, you've got 12 years. You've got 12 years taking place. And we're told virtually nothing. Virtually nothing. We know that the wise men will visit in Matthew 2. The family are going to flee to Egypt to escape Herod's rage. After Herod's death, they're going to return safely to Nazareth. And so Jesus became known as Jesus of Nazareth. His life was connected to the town of his birth. 7 times in Acts, he's known as Jesus of Nazareth. It was about 80 kilometres north of Jerusalem, near Galilee, where he picked so many of his disciples. And the term Nazarene became a title of derision. It was like to be a Corinthian, according to the Gentiles. When Philip finds Nathanael, his brother, he says, "We found him, Jesus of Nazareth." And you know Nathanael's response, well, what good can come from there? It's the wrong town. It's the wrong town. Surely it must be Jerusalem. Surely he's got to come from there. We know from other scriptures that Jesus is raised in a carpenter's home. The marriage between Joseph and Mary, among other things, provided Jesus with siblings, that he could grow up with a family of other children and of training. Carpenters in Bible times, like today, not much has changed, except the technology. You need the same skill, but different technology. They would build and they would repair things. Jesus would learn a trade of his father Joseph. He'd work with his hands, he'd deal with the customers. And then look at verse 40. The child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. This describes those next dozen or so years until you get to the temple incident. Jesus grew like every other child. He developed like every other child except for the lack of a sin nature. That was the only difference. Our own children, we ourselves, we didn't need to learn the bad stuff. We came programmed to do it. We came programmed to rebel and to find our own way in life. But Jesus, with God's grace upon him, he grew and he became strong in spirit. And it's really an amazing thing to me, because it's almost like we're too scared to wonder what was it for Jesus to grow up, because it says very clearly that he grew stronger, he was filled with wisdom, the grace of God was upon him. He grew. He studied things. He learned how to count, and he learned science. And I'm trying to think here, look, okay, so we've got God's perfect son, he's a boy. Does that mean that he's always top of the class? Right? Does that mean that? Because he's growing as a human. Is it possible that he has stronger subjects than others? Is it possible that he has certain hobbies that he likes doing? Right? Now, thankfully, we're not given all of those ins and outs, because, as I said, we'd be endlessly distracted. But if you can grow in wisdom, then it assumes that in his humanity there are things that he had to learn. Let me put it this way. It's his father who's teaching him to be the carpenter, right? His dad's teaching him how to be the carpenter. I don't think it's like when Jesus gets the tools for the first time and he's the world's best carpenter. I say that with respect, but you get what I'm saying. Otherwise, there's no growth in his humanity. There's no development if he's not learning and taking things on board from those around him. So humanly speaking, there were no shortcuts for Jesus. He did have to work and study and rest and listen and all these kinds of things, just like we need to. And in fact, those who, and you'll get the children that, you see them occasionally, the Tiger Woods, he's playing like a pro at 5 or 6, and then you got some kids that are playing the piano and the instruments, and kids are at university age of 12. Well, they're the exceptions, and often many of those people really struggle just to be with normal people because they're in that little category, and they got no real peers apart from those much older than them. But Jesus would grow in his humanity. And if you look at verse 41 of Luke 2, it says his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. He grew up in a deeply observant Jewish home. We know later when he's there in Galilee, Capernaum, he's in the synagogue, as was his custom. His custom was, I'm going to be in the synagogue even as a grown man. They would make the long journey to remember God's deliverance from Egypt. The Passover was one of 3 major feasts, along with Pentecost and Tabernacles. This Passover was an 8-day event. It was a long event. And we have both Joseph and Mary going with extended family. And that's interesting because the women didn't have to come. Just like the women didn't need to be here tonight. But you came. This, again, is a little bit like Hannah in the Old Testament where she's coming because she wants to be there. She wants to be there. She doesn't want to miss out. She wants to be there worshipping God and thinking about the Exodus. This was proof of Mary's devotion. It says in verse 42, when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. This would have taken a few days' journey. They travelled with extended family members to make it safe. If you travel with more people, harder to get robbed. More backup. If you've got thieves and other people trying to attack you, you travel in numbers. And I'm certain those Jewish kids would have asked the question. They would have asked the question, are we there yet? Even if they were put up on a donkey and they didn't have to do the walking. Yeah? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? You can be certain. Be certain that question was asked. But think about arriving in Jerusalem, that eternal city, with tens of thousands of travellers. It would have been a carnival atmosphere. The closest thing we would have would be sort of like the Easter show. Just surrounded by thousands of people. However, they are there to worship God. And that was the exciting thing. Joseph would have offered a lamb for the family in the temple. He would have done this previously, but we're told about Jesus' 12th year. We know that when he turned 13, he would become a full member of the synagogue after a period of training and instruction and scripture memorization. And so these years were those of preparation. And look at verse 43. When they had finished the days, as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem. And Joseph and his mother did not know it. They didn't know it. And of course, the focus of this passage is not is not the feast itself, it's what happens after the feast. It's this, you see this division now between Jesus and his parents. And this verse sounds very strange to Western ears in verse 44, but supposing him to have been in the company, that is with the family, they thought he was with the rest of the family. They went a day's journey and sought him among their relatives and acquaintances. They assumed that he was safely in the care of others. What is about to happen is entirely out of character for Jesus. It's nothing that seems to have happened before. They just assumed, as we assume, that, we're at church and the kids are okay, kids are right, can't hear any screaming, must be fine. No news is good news. No news is good news. So they figured that he was with the extended family. But then again, remember, Jesus on the cusp of being a young adult. He's not a toddler. Not a toddler where, you've got to know who he or she is with. He's moving towards manhood. Now, it's been said that Jesus had not been disobedient in any sense. He had not disobeyed his parents in remaining behind. Nor had they been negligent or careless. After all, he was their obedient son all these years. But here's the point. Something was about to change. Something was going to change. It wasn't like him. He doesn't just disappear on us like this. And in a sense, Joseph and Mary must have been waiting for some kind of watershed day. They knew how he came into the world. How could you forget? They knew he was earmarked by God for something unique and never ever to be repeated. And so you'd think deep down in their hearts they would know that something was going to give one day. Something was going to happen. And if you look at verse 45, so when they did not find him, they turned to Jerusalem seeking him. Now it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking questions. It took 3 days for them to get back to him. They had travelled a day, one whole day, figuring that he was with them. So that's first day. They take a day travelling back, and then another day to find him. And this would have been troubling. Have not we at some point misplaced our children at times, even for an hour or two, and time slows down. The worst things come across your mind in terms of where have they gone missing, and whatever it was, and all of those kinds of things. And so when they find him, there's a relief, but there's also an amazement. He's not just sitting quietly in a corner. He's not even waiting for them to find him. He is busy. He's busy. In fact, you could say he is in his element. In fact, you could say Jesus is right at home. He's right at home, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And this method of learning hasn't changed much in Jewish teaching today. That's still the way learning is done. Often Jewish Torah students study in pairs. They study in pairs to this day. And there's the constant give and take and questioning and answering, because you can get to the nub of things very, very quickly that way, rather than just sort of talking to a whole bunch of people of varying interests. Okay. It's been said that this is the only time the gospel records Jesus as a student. The rest of the time he's the teacher when he starts his ministry. He's out there teaching. But now he is a student. Okay. Beware of people who can never be students in the first place. Beware of people who just can't even be students, but they want to go and let everyone know how everything is. Even Jesus had that period, and he is the student. He is the student here. Don't misinterpret this passage. And it says here in verse 47, all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And I have typically read this as he's showing his omniscience. That's how I've sort of understood. But I don't think that's the sense here. It's not about omniscience that he's displaying. He is revealing a heart and a mind that's been taking everything in for years. Everything in for years. And he wants to talk to some people about it. He's got questions and he has reasons and he has some answers. And so this doesn't seem to be sort of an early display of omniscience flashing across the screen. We're showing his heart to God. Years of his parents taking him to synagogue, to the Passover in Jerusalem, and those penetrating questions coming to the best Jewish minds. And even the scribes, even these learned Jews here, realise that they haven't spoken to many 12-year-olds like this one. Not many. Not just the knowledge, not just the answers, but the heart. The heart. The Lord during his earthly ministry would amaze the crowds with his miracles and teachings, but now the 12-year-old Jesus amazes the scribes and his parents with that public display of his heart to know God. Our children can have a heart for God. They can have a very sensitive heart for God. They can, and they do. And then I want you to see this interaction between Jesus and his parents. His parents. Sometimes people are very careful not to call Joseph Jesus' father for obvious reasons, right? If you call him father, then you don't believe the virgin birth, yeah? Well, look at verse 48. So when they saw him, they were amazed, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I have sought you anxiously." Your dad and I have been looking for you. That was the family. He's in the family. Please understand that. Joseph is not this fellow that, has no say over what's happening with Jesus. He's his dad, for all intents and purposes. But for that virgin conception and birth. Was Mary aware of the virgin birth? Yes, she was. Was Joseph father? Yes, he was the father. As legal earthly guardian. Well, his parents are amazed, but they are irritated. They're concerned. She's troubled. Mary is not happy with what has happened here. That's clear, is it not? They have been anxious. It's one job that mothers have from God, to be anxious about their children. Yeah, it comes with motherhood. Anxiety. Anxiety. Yeah, and worry. We've got to worry about someone. We've got some kids. Yeah. We get anxious. Get anxious. But there is a change. You can feel the hurt in Mary's voice. She's not used to this. She's not used to this. And we're going to see that there are things that Mary is going to need to learn. Her and Joseph are going to need to learn something out of this situation. Now, this question here in verse 48, the confusion, the pain, what's Jesus going to say? Is he going to comfort her? Is he going to kind of apologise? Just smooth things over? Look at verse 49. He said to them, "Why did you seek me?" Why did you seek me? Why is this troubling you? She wasn't expecting that. I can tell you that now. Did you not know? I thought you'd know. I thought you'd know that I must be about my Father's business. Don't think about companies. Think about concerns concerns, interests. Do you know that I have to be about my Father's interests? I'm concerned about his concerns. The things that move God, and his concerns are now my concerns. He doesn't even back down and apologise. Now, he's not being rude. He's not answering her back, right? But it's fairly direct. And it must have cut to some degree or another. Jesus insisted on doing exactly what he was doing. He was insisting on it. If the Father wanted him to stay behind and learn some more, then that's what he would need to do. That's what he'd need to do. Do you know this passage here in Luke 2 is the first time anyone in the Bible claimed God as his personal Father? First time. In his humanity, he has a mother but no earthly father. In his deity, he exists with an eternal Father alongside the Holy Spirit. Later, Jesus would infuriate people for talking about God as his Father. They wanted to kill him because that was a claim of equality. As one writer said, the fact that his entire life was controlled by the divine I must be about my Father's business, dawned on him at this age. It was his coming of age, so to speak. He was here to do the Father's will. And we need to have this truth dawn on us too. That God has put us on this earth to do his will. Whatever that is, as varied as that is going to be for us. For our little ones here that are growing up, it may be they're going to stay here in Melton, or they're not. Or they're not. We've just got to prepare them for whatever God wants them to do. That's how things are. We've got to prepare them as best we can for whatever God has for them. It could be here, could be anywhere. To do God's will solves a lot of directional issues. Takes a lot of frustration out of the equation. So Jesus tells his parents, look, I've got to be about my Father's business. Now, you'd think that would clear things up, wouldn't you? Look at verse 50. But they didn't understand. They didn't understand. Look, if there were two people who would have understood, it must have been Mary and Joseph. I mean, she was the virgin. And her husband, he knows the miracle that happened. He knows Jesus is unique. He knows that. If there were two people on earth who could have understood this, I mean, they're both visited by angels. The angel Gabriel, I should say, both visited. Well, if they struggled to understand Jesus' words, is it any wonder that we struggle to understand Jesus' words? Any wonder? As we've worked through Job this year, I'm reading books and these very brilliant people are saying, we have no clue what this verse means. Well, could be two or three things, we think. That's helpful. But Mary and Joseph, they struggled to understand Jesus' words too. They struggled. We've got to realise that. Look, when Jesus begins his public ministry, Mary is there waiting for him, trying to get his attention, and she's going to learn a similar lesson. He is now devoted to the Father's will publicly. Not her suggestions or guidance anymore. So here's where we are in Luke 2. From infancy to 12 years old. Verse 40. From 41 to 51, you have the temple incident. And then in verse number 51, look at 51. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them. But his mother kept all these things in her heart. Verse 52, Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and men. Those two verses describe the next 18 years. 18 years. They're almost an anticlimax because you're expecting Jesus to just start at the age of 12. Start him now. Maybe 13, 14, 15 max. He's ready to go. He's ready. He can debate with the scribes. Theologically, he's there. But he's not. Because the Father determined that he needed another 18 years. When it says in verse 51 that he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them, it has the idea of rendering obedience. Of rendering obedience to them. From 12 through to 30, and at some point Joseph, it seems, passes away. He is going to serve Mary, is going to serve his family, he's going to serve his community, he's going to continue as a carpenter as best as we know. Now obviously from 12 to 30 it's going to be different from 0 to 12. Of course it is. It's going to be very different. He's going to have more freedoms and more choices and more discernment, all of those things. But Jesus himself indeed honoured his family for those 18 years. And I might add something else, that Jesus, he would submit to parents that didn't really fully understand or appreciate the incident back in the temple. They were mystified. Why have you done this to us? Why have you put us through this? You've hurt us. Oh, you were doing a good thing. There, discussing God's word. It's a good thing, but boy, it really hurt. Really hurt. Now let's come back to this topic here of a long obedience in the same direction. Yes, Jesus' life was comparatively short, but could I suggest that if you're living as the perfect son, then the perfect man in a sinful world, that's a long obedience, is it not? To be on this earth 30 years without sin. At times having your heart grieved because of the evident sin around you. These were long years. These were long years. These were testing years. These were obscure years, and yet he had to live that kind of life so that he could endure the ordinary trials of life and the ordinary sufferings of life. He'll later be tempted by Satan in the desert, wilderness for 40 days. Yet Jesus did in his own life what we couldn't do in ours. He did what we couldn't, keep God's law perfectly. So those years were not wasted years. They weren't like, come on, let's just get on with the main thing. Let's just get on to the ministry. These were necessary times. And so that those 3 years of public ministry, so powerful, so unique, so fruitful, because in part, those 30 years of a long obedience in the same direction. I mean, what prepares any of us for adulthood or whatever you want to call it? What prepares any of us to do what God has called us to do? Normally years of just sort of listening and learning and keeping your head down. Right? That helps. That helps. God prepares us by putting us in places where we can learn and trust and serve him and get opportunities and whatever it is. In fact, if you go back to verse 51, Mary needs to, it says, but Mary kept all these things in her heart. Mary would need to meditate on this for years. For years. We know, as I said, years later, she's still struggling to let go of her son. Well, that's understandable. That's understandable, to let him go. What would this mean to the whole family? And yet he would grow into manhood. And look at verse 52. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and man. That idea in 52 of in favour with God and men, it has the idea that Jesus enjoyed not only the loving kindness of God, but the friendliness of people around him. As one writer said, Jesus was the sort of person you wanted to be with. Well, that was very convicting. Very convicting. He wasn't the sort of person you avoided, Mr. Perfect. Mr. Perfect. He was the sort of person you wanted around, you wanted to be with. He didn't repel people by his holiness. He attracted people. He's like Joseph in Egypt, very winsome chap. He's like Daniel in Babylon, a winsome fellow with his 3 friends. Here's a fellow that you actually wanted to be with. God's grace does that. He does that. As Philip Ryken said, he said that God calls us to serve him by following others he's put around us. And he said, rather than struggling with this, Jesus embraced it. He embraced it. When we learn to embrace it in the way that Jesus did, we will enjoy God's favour, his favour. And so Jesus did have a long obedience. And these were worthwhile years. These were not wasted years. And let me finish with this little quote, that the carpenter's shop is as sacred as the courts of the temple, and that to obey Mary was to do the will of the Father in heaven.